It was April 2020. We were in the thick of the pandemic. As a freelance journalist, I was frantically pitching story ideas on the coronavirus from my home in Bangalore, where we were under lockdown. As a reporter extensively covering disability rights, I found that stories of frontline health workers left out the perspectives of doctors with disabilities who are more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Knowing well it was important to be reported, I pitched it to several international publications. An editor from a top global health publication reverted with feedback. I opened their email with bated breath, wondering if this could be my opportunity to bag my first byline with them. In front of me was a message I hadn't imagined would come from an international publication that proclaims to be diverse and inclusive in its reporting. "We are going to pass," the email read, adding that it is hard to understand how people who, as you describe, can barely walk or use their hands are able to practice medicine. I was aghast. Yes, people who cannot use their limbs to full capacity can still use their minds. They can be physicians and are practicing, even in your country. I wanted to scream back, but I didn't. I could see a pattern here, a pattern of ignorance, lack of empathy, and a resistance to understanding someone different from them. I'd seen enough of it throughout my career, and how then discrimination stems from this resistance. I moved on from this publication and continued reporting on disability, realizing that this inability of newsrooms to understand people with disabilities and poor coverage, often perpetuating negative stereotypes, is directly related to the absence of disabled journalists in their newsrooms.
Underrepresentation happens in different ways, and I'll tell you some quick stories. Once, a coworker asked me if he was black or not. I know it may sound weird to you, but believe me, in Brazil, this is a thing. That's because he had never had to think about it until he started working in a newsroom where most of people were white. And when I say majority, I really mean it. A survey of journalists from all over Brazil shows that at least 77% of them identify themselves as white. And our newsroom was no different from that. Just for context, I'd like you to understand that the Brazilian population is composed of at least 55% of people that identify as black or brown, and just 43.2% identify as white. For my project, I heard reports of people developing mental health issues and even suicidal thoughts because they were constantly in a hostile environment in the newsrooms. Clearly, something is wrong with the way the newsroom receives these professionals. They don't feel like they belong, and this affects them and consequently the journalism that is produced. Once a colleague asked me how I felt being the only black person in our newsroom. I replied that I thought that was normal, which was true at the time. I didn't think it could change, but now I am determined to at least make the conversation happen properly in our workplace. My interviewee said that due to the lack of diversity, Brazilian journalism reproduces stereotypes during its coverage, acting as gatekeepers for a certain demographic group. Also, when it is escalated to management positions, it results in an overall disinterest in hiring different people for the newsrooms. I even heard stories about articles being labeled as activism, just because they featured only Afro-Brazilian sources, a comment that would never happen with an all-white sources article, for example.
For my fellowship, I've dug into the barriers for disabled journalists in Indian newsrooms. Basic infrastructural accessibility in newsrooms, low awareness about disability among co-workers, and inflexibility to rework processes to include everyone are just a few of the many. I know that making newsrooms accessible and implementing accessibility in news may seem daunting, but if publications could make it a goal and execute one thing at a time, soon there will be a time when everything they do will be the accessible way, and they'll know no other way to do it. I'm optimistic.
And as for race solutions, there is some hope also. The conversation is already happening, and the younger generation is more vocal than ever. The scenario may change sooner than we think. Thank you.